With the smooth skins bound to our character, we can continue the process of painting skin weights. First, we need to look for problematic artifacts left over from our automatic bind. Positioning our character in various poses will help us identify these areas better by displaying where we're losing volume or getting unusual deformations. There are also some potentially troublesome areas, such as the belt and the armor strap, that we'll tackle using the component editor. After that, we'll work our way up to the character's head, where we can address the various stretching issues in the beard and the mouth caused by the closely neighboring geometry. Once that's done, we'll look at the character's hair and distribute those weights to get the desired effect from rotating our hair joint. Finally, we'll mirror our work on the symmetrical elements of our character to save time and keep things looking consistent. Before we open the Paint Skin Weights tool, we actually want to pose this model in a particular way so that we can see where we're losing volume in our mesh. So I'm just going to start with the arm. I normally just start here, and then I move on to the rest of the limbs, and then I handle the confusing, messy area in between later. So I'm just going to bring this arm up. Normally you see a lot of issues here in the armpit. See how part of his rib cage is being pulled with the arm. And there's also a lot of volume loss with his shoulder like we saw before. And the wrist is also a funny area. So I'm just going to move this a little bit into a pose where it sort of showcases all those issues. And then we're going to jump into the tool itself and start to tackle those issues. So this funny pose here kind of shows we get a little bit of the elbow area here where it's pinching a little bit. And then we get the wrist where it's collapsing. And this shoulder chest area also is an issue. So with that, we can click on the mesh and just jump into the Paint Skin Weights tool. The biggest problem area of this arm right now is the way this arm is pulling the rib cage out and pushing this shoulder down as it rotates. And that's because there's just too much influence over here. So we'll want to remove that. So I'm going to go into the tool settings and choose a smooth brush. And then I'm just going to choose a opacity of like, I don't know, around half, and a value of 1 for now, because I can always invert and revert this selection by holding down the control key as I paint. So I'm actually going to be wanting to remove these influences. So I'm just going to hold down control and start stroking these away. And these are going to be pulling back to a more natural position because they're no longer being affected by these adjusted joints. And so I'm going to go through and do that with this shirt here and the parts of the underlying mesh that are the body. I'm just holding down control and clicking and just painting away at these. And I want to use the smooth brush because a hard edge here would look kind of weird. I still want some influence here, so when he does move, it looks a little natural, but I don't want to remove it completely because then it'll look jagged. And if you ever want to adjust the size of your brush, you can hold down the B button while you have your mouse on the viewport, and you can see that another icon appears over your cursor. You can click the left mouse button and drag either which way, and you can size your brush up and down. That way you're not changing the size in the tool settings. I almost never change the size of the brush in here because I always have the ability to change it right in the viewport. Using the hotkeys is much, much faster. So I'm going to continue to hold down control and bring some of this geometry back down to where it belongs, and hopefully get things looking pretty good so that we're not seeing weird deformations anymore. And it's all just a matter of using your own personal judgment and your own preference. So we're going to pull these around, and in some cases I like overdo it a little bit. So in that case, I'm just going to push it back by releasing control and clicking on the area, because this area here needs to be influenced by the shoulder, I think. So I'm going to add more influence there to rebuild that volume. The same for the crux of the elbow here. I'm going to rebuild this volume too, just by slowly pushing and adding influence to the shoulder. And to remove that hard edge there, I'm going to just graze that little edge loop there in the middle and maybe size my brush down too. I'm just going to add a little more influence there until I get it looking kind of the way I'd expect it to look in real life if this was a real person. And now that I'm done being sidetracked, I'm going to go back over and start removing more of the influence here, because we actually don't want the shoulder controlling too much of the shoulder itself, because we have this clavicle bone that's going to be controlling most of that. So this area way out here, this shouldn't be affected by it at all. And some of these areas down here, they don't need any influence. I feel like this belt, I could just remove the influence. So I'm actually going to change my opacity to the max opacity, so 1. And then I'm going to give myself a solid brush. I'm just going to hold control and paint over that, so I'm removing the influence completely, making sure I'm grabbing all the underlying meshes and stuff, because this particular model has a bunch of layers to it. And a big challenge for us is to make sure that none of those layers stick through each other while this guy moves around. So got to keep that in mind. And it's just a matter of playing with it and guessing and checking and all that. So I'm going to go back to my soft brush, bring it back down to half, and I'm going to remove this underlying mesh here. You can see some of the jagged edges sticking out. And if you just get your cursor to pop right over a vertice there, you can click and you know that it's going to grab that vertice and push it back to where it belongs. Because it's actually, the brush isn't painting on the polygons, it's painting on each vertice. So I'm just going to keep removing this until things start to shape up. The shoulder still looks pretty collapsed, but I think instead of pushing it away, because it doesn't seem like it's helping too much here anymore, instead of pushing that away, I'm going to pull it with the clavicle joint. So what I can do is go into this tool, go back into the hierarchy and grab the clavicle joint here, the left clavicle, and now I can add influence here so things start to look a little more appropriate. So instead of holding control down, I'm just going to click, I'm going to size my brush up a little bit again, and maybe, hopefully, get this shaped the way it should be under his shirt. And it's really a matter of playing around with it. There's no one way to do this. You're probably going to go about doing it a different way than I am. And a lot of times, you might do a lot of this work here, getting things to look right, and then you might move it and it looks wrong in another pose, and then you just got to refine that pose, and so on and so forth. So this is kind of a very organic process. So I'm going to hold control and remove influence, clavicle influence from the belt. So I'm going to go back to the solid brush and make this max opacity, because I don't believe the clavicle should ever control this belt here. So I'm going to remove all that stuff and some of this stuff here. And I can switch back to the soft brush whenever, like maybe it needs to kind of gradate from there to here with the clavicle movement. So I want to make sure I have a nice gradient there. So this looks pretty good so far. I think I'm going to move on to the elbow area. It actually looks pretty okay over here. Maybe there's a little bit of volume loss. So all I really would want to do is add some more volume to this kind of chunk here, just to make sure it's not losing too much volume as he rotates. We want to make sure he always is showing off his beefy forearm muscles. It might look a little funny that it's kind of clipping like with the bicep and with the wrist and stuff, but in a lot of cases it's better than having kind of a noodly rubbery look to have more of a rigid joint there. So I'm going to quit out of this tool just to adjust the model a little bit, and you can see now that joint area, we're not getting a collapse anymore, and it's not as distracting as it would be if it was all kind of bending in a noodly way. So, but I'm still getting a little bit of a crunchiness right in this crux here when I move it in. So I'm gonna just keep it out here, keep his wrist out here. And I'm gonna go back into the tool by selecting the mesh and going back to the tool. And I'm just gonna add the weight right here and hope that that's gonna solve that issue there. So I'm gonna quit out again, look at that again. It's okay, it's fine. There's always gonna be refinement that we can make, but I think for now that looks okay. The wrist, however, it's kind of a funny area. As we twist it and move it, we start to see some of that forearm bending there. So we might want to remove that at some point. But it doesn't look too terrible. It's underneath his glove anyway, so it's not super noticeable. What we can do to make this area a little more consistent as it moves is go back into the tool and just grab the eyedropper, select the eyedropper, and pick a point on the forearm where it's intersecting with that glove. And we can select that. And now we know exactly the value that the forearm is using for that area, so we can apply it to the glove by painting on the glove. And now when it moves, it's not actually going to be clipping anymore because we've painted over that area with the same value. And I might want to lower the value as we move away from that area so we get a smooth transition into the glove. And you can always use the eyedropper tool to reference weights that look good on one part of the mesh onto another. So like some parts of this glove look smoother than others, like this top part. So I'm going to click the eyedropper tool and grab that weight. And it turns out it was pretty accurate, or it's pretty close to what we already had. And I'm going to use that same value to paint underneath so we get the same effect, essentially. So I'm going to quit out of that. That looks a little better. Now we're not getting crazy clipping in there as we rotate that wrist around. But there's still like this gross, gooey, like fleshy arm movement there at the edge of the forearm, which isn't right. That doesn't look right at all to me. So I'm going to actually just make that 100% forearm weighted, so it's not being controlled by the wrist at all. And that'll bring that back, and we won't get a gross Stretch Armstrong effect. So now we strengthened that up with some weights. We can move that, and we don't get any movement there. There's still some on the top. We can fix it. Go back in the tool. Wherever that yellow is, we'll turn that to red. And now we know that that area is not going to move, and no one will think this guy is made of gum or anything. So now that we're done with that, I'm actually just going to reposition the controller. So we're back at default. So I'm going to go into the channel box and make the translate and the rotate value 0. And now we're back to our default position. And I can give it another little move just to see how we're looking. It doesn't look too bad. So I think we can move on from there for now and take care of the legs and the feet next.